All right, now that we've had a few more people come in, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Drew Williams. I am the marketing manager for Kobiton, and thank you all for joining us today on our webinar, Tiny Fish in a Huge Pond, Effective Testing for Small Teams. Today, we're joined by some great panelists. We've got the Kobiton CTO, Frank Moyer. We've got Michael Larson, who is many things, including tester, writer, instructor, and podcast producer. And we've also got Paul Grzoffi, who is not only a testing influencer, if you will, but also the principal automation architect at Magenic. And with that said, we'll go ahead and get started with the first topic, thinking agile. Frank?
So before I go into the details of testing and the importance of agile and thinking small with testing, I want to talk about the importance of tiny fish in the overall economy. The Brookings Institute conducted a study that cited just 4% of firms contribute over 60% of job creation. So tiny fish play such an important role in the overall economy. And the common characteristics of these 4% are they tend to be small, they tend to be young, and they're concentrated in knowledge intensive areas. So, and one of my favorite quotes from Fred Wilson is, when it's David versus Goliath, I like to bet on David. The odds are better, and often so are the results. The goal of every startup and small company is to unseat the incumbent, and the goal of every incumbent is to stay alive. So when we look at the benefits of small, concise tests, I'm going to address that first. And by the way of example, we had a customer come in a couple weeks ago we spent about 2 hours troubleshooting an Appium script that they were having, and their script was taking about 15 minutes to run. When it failed about the 10-minute mark, and we fixed it then, and then it failed at the 11-minute mark. And every time it executed, it went a minute further. So if you can imagine that in the macro view, you're constantly having to go back to a point where something fails. If you make that smaller, if those tests are 2 to 3 minutes, those errors are found sooner and they're easier to analyze. As a result, there's this multiplicative effect of complexity in testing, where the effort to troubleshoot and maintain test scripts increases exponentially as compared to the test script execution time. And I would also like to point out that as important as the test script time is, the modular structure is probably as important, if not more important. Making sure that the test scripts are well structured and use a modular approach using technologies like TestNG allow application changes to be isolated to a smaller set of the tests. So that's the benefits of this end up reaping rewards over the long term with the organization. Likewise, on the first point, small frequent releases allow for ease of troubleshooting issues when there is an issue with a release. I think from one of the drawbacks or some of the things that we're thinking about here at Kobiton is when you run a test every day, if you're releasing every day, how do you know what test to run? Should you run a full regression test every day? And what if that regression test takes 25 hours to run? How do you prioritize what to run and what not to run based on risks of what's changed and the impacts to the customer usage? So these are some of the things that we're working on tackling within Kobiton in 2019. Thank you, Drew.
Awesome, Frank. Thanks for that. Paul?
Yeah, so from my standpoint, the small frequent releases, it's basically a logic approach there. The smaller your changes are, the easier it should be in general to debug because you've made fewer changes. It also should be easier to test, and there's a big should around that one because it depends on what you change. If you change something that's cloistered off to a particular feature, it should be easier to test. But if you make a small change, even in some base, even a small change in some base core operations of your app or your product, it might require extensive testing. So in general, though, the benefit of the small frequent releases is the ability to incrementally deliver value. And depending on what your clients are doing with your software, what you give them today may make them significantly better off than they were yesterday, even if it's not everything they asked for. So the notion of delivering value sooner to the users, but also delivering value back to yourself, because the sooner you get a feature out, perhaps the sooner you start either getting revenue or stopping some sort of bleeding of money there. From a small, concise test standpoint, I hear a lot of times about automation tests that are too big, automation tests that are too small, or just tests in general that are too big or too small. So in my opinion, tests should be exactly as big as they should be. So context specific, no more than should be in a particular test or particular automated script, but also no less. So sometimes you might find a situation where it makes sense to have a lot of highly a lot of very shallow, very short checks for like, hey, I just deployed my new software into my QA environment. I want to make sure it's not egregiously broken. But there are other cases where you're actually performing, here's a subset of how the user is going to use our product, and it has to progress through this state-driven environment. In order to be able to do that, you will need to be able to go through that state-driven environment and put the software or the product or the widget that's being created during the steps through each of those steps. Otherwise, you won't know. And a lot of times it's difficult to jump right into step 3 because the product is not set up to be testable or automatable, that you can fake out step 1 and step 2 in an economically or a valuably sufficient manner. So really it matters what kind of situation you're in, and going towards smaller for the reasons that Frank was saying is generally better, but not always.
Fantastic points, Paul. Michael, how about you?
Sure. So on my end, I look at the idea that when you're dealing with small, frequent releases, it may be an ideal situation. However, it's entirely possible that your organization or your customers and their needs don't really allow for that. That's actually the case with the product that I'm currently working with. I've worked with products that released something almost every day, and then I'm working with products that release every couple of months or every few months, because that's just the nature of the cycle that they do. Now, the key here is I don't look at it as a matter of, well, do you do small frequently releases or one big one? It doesn't have to be an or situation. It can be an and, in the sense that what we prefer to do is we do small frequent releases and tests within our organization, and we're able to group our things into smaller bite-sized nuggets and work through them and test them in a way that isn't going to be, okay, now we have to do this massive full court press at the end and do this huge, just because we're going to be releasing code. We've already done this. We've already tested it. We've already checked it out in a larger environment. Yes, we will have to go back and do some level of regression and verify that we haven't horribly broken something, but you can do both is the key, is what I'm trying to say. And when you're definitely working in a small organization, it behooves you to encourage to say, look, even if we're not releasing every day or every week, let's treat our internal environment as though we were, because it's going to make everybody's lives, if not easier, at least much more manageable. As far as the benefits of small and concise tests, I definitely agree. I think that you do well to be able to put together something that is going to be quicker to respond to, quicker to debug and work with. And also the one thing that one thing that hasn't been talked about here is parallelization. I mean, yes, it can take you 25 hours to run all of your tests in serial on a single machine, but you could potentially, especially if your tests are small enough and they're atomic enough, you could split that up and you could run them on multiple machines at the same time. We do something similar to that. That's what we do in our current testing environment, is we run most of our tests in parallel so that we're getting the benefits of that scale. So instead of waiting 25 hours to run a full test sequence, it takes us 30 minutes. And which is still, if you're doing multiple builds a day, that's still a lot, but it's a pretty good return. But to be able to do that, you need to have tests that are small enough and that are separate enough and don't have requirements that need to have other things in place to do that. And that's something that we spent a long time working on to get to that point.
Thanks, Michael. Making testing an organizational focus. We'll start with you, Michael.
Okay, absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the things that I would strongly encourage every organization to do is to focus on the idea that quality doesn't get baked in after the fact. Quality has to start from the very beginning. One of the things that if you've followed my blog or any of my talks, I speak a considerable amount on accessibility and inclusive design, and with an emphasis more lately on that latter phrase than the former, especially when it comes to accessibility. Very often what ends up happening is if you try to bake it in later, it's a much harder process, and you really have to work very hard to modify your product to do something. Whereas if you focus on it early on to say, we're going to design our product with this feature in mind to be accessible, to be usable by as many people as possible, that's not something that a tester is going to say, well, here's what you have to do for it. The whole organization has to buy into that. They all have to be aware that this is what the goal is. This is how we're going to meet it. This is a level of quality that we have to meet. And everybody has to be involved in making sure that that happens. So it can't just be the testers championing this. Everybody has to be on board for it. And you have to really be thinking about these things from note one of a story. If everybody's not on the same page and everybody's not thinking about it and testing it, it's just not going to happen. As to who else should be involved in testing, I believe everybody in the organization needs to be involved in testing because we're actively using the product. And if we're not actively using the product, we should ask why and encourage us to say, if this is good enough for our customers, it better darn well be good enough for us. And I'm very much an advocate of dog fooding products and making sure that we live on it and that we experience it and that we use it as actively or as aggressively as our customers do. Because if it passes us, that's not going to say that we'll find every solution or that we'll figure out every problem. But it does mean that by us living with it, we can at least see what's the user experience? How do we feel using this? And if we're frustrated with it, it's a really good bet that our customers will be. So I believe everybody in the organization that faces with the product in any way, shape, or form should actively be involved in testing. And the best way to do that is use it just like your customers would.
Thanks, Michael. Frank?
Yeah, I want to tag on to what Michael said and agree that it's not just the testing part of the organization that's responsible for the quality. And we're going to talk about this in a few slides about the measurements. The best way to galvanize a team around a goal is to define one or two key measurements that everyone can take responsibility in making successful. So if we have something that everybody is shooting for, then it's easier for each part of the organization to understand their role in making that happen. One of the highest quality products I ever worked on was a product that was used by 60 million tax filers in the United Kingdom. And I attribute the level of quality on that product to the focus on quality throughout the organization. And it was the test team was driving a lot of the quality, but also the product manager. Every waking moment, the product manager spent using it as Michael described it. He was using it. He was eating his own dog food. He was filing his taxes, using it, and unearthing all the issues that he was finding, and then the customer as well. So inherent to that is making sure that with these leading measurements that everyone's working towards on achieving, everybody knows their responsibility in making that successful, that it's not just the testing organization.
Yes, I am. Sorry about that. So I like the comments that have been made so far. I'm on board with pretty much all of that. I especially like the thought around we're not going to test in quality. That doesn't happen. That doesn't work. And winding it further back, going on to kind of like Michael was talking about the accessibility, the observability, the controllability. The more that you increase those abilities, the more we're going to be able to explore and to test and to get into the nooks and crannies of the product itself. Um, that delves directly into the second point, which is who else should be involved in testing, and the answer is everyone, because that word involved is a very broad word, which I like. So everyone should be involved in testing. Does that mean everyone is a tester? No. Does that mean that everyone does a little bit of testing? Maybe. But what it really means is that everyone is looking at the testability of what it is that we are delivering. A long time ago, I had a sort of a partner team that was working with the main automation team, and we were delivering tools to them, and part of their job was to test the tools before they got delivered out to the actual testers who were going to use the tools. And sometimes the feedback was, how am I going to test this? We should not develop this if we can't test it. And largely, I think that's true. As things have gotten more and more complex over the years, we realize we can't test everything, so we start making, hopefully, business and risk value assumptions or value decisions on what we're going to test first, what it would be okay if we didn't test well, or if we ran out of time, didn't get tested at all. But the notion of testability and the whole team being involved in this aspect of quality and delivering a quality product that is fit for use is something that is for the whole team, and that testing and enabling testing is absolutely a key part of that.
Moving on to the concept of eliminating testing silos. And Paul, we'll go ahead and start with you.
So for me, this just flows on right from the previous topic, where how are you going to make something that is testable? Well, not everybody knows as much about testing as everyone else does, and not everyone knows as much about development or delivery or automation or whatever as other people do in your team and in your organization. So if we're not communicating about what the needs are, hey, we have a user who needs to be able to submit an email for notifications. That's phenomenal. How are we going to test that? How are we going to automate that? How are we going to be able to get into, as I mentioned before, the nooks and the crannies of that particular piece of software, to the particular pieces of software, so that we can, as best we can, explain how this software is going to work in certain situations. We have to have the communication for that. If we're not having communication, there will be a miss. Either there will be a step that we miss, a corner case that we miss, that maybe it's an important corner case. Hey, only one of our users ever does that, but it's the one that pays 10 times more of our revenue than all the other users. So maybe we should pay attention to how that particular user is using that corner case feature. So having this level of communication from a technology standpoint, but also from a business standpoint of who our users are, how they contribute to the company's bottom line, how they are using the software, and how they are running up against issues and working around those issues with the software. That's all key information that should be fed back in and considered when we're making decisions about, I'm going to use this testing framework, or I'm going to use this development framework or language or development approach. And then as far as streamlining collaboration, so clearly the best collaboration, or not necessarily the best, but the most high bandwidth communication is generally face-to-face, followed then by video, followed then by phone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is most of us work with distributed teams. Myself, I'm working remotely most of the time. So what do we do about that? Well, what we need to do about that is we need to want to make it work. When I first started with one company a few years ago, the complaint was, well, we're not co-located, so we're never going to be able to do Scrum the right way. I'm like, no, I've worked on Scrum teams that were not co-located. The difference was they really wanted it to work. So we, as the members of that team, we wanted this shared collaboration to work. So we figured out ways to make it work instead of fighting against it. So there has to be a desire to make the communication work. And then the streamlining comes from what makes sense in this particular situation.
Michael, how about you?
So I'm going to follow on with Paul and say very similar. So the organization that I'm with right now was actually designed to be a distributed team from the get-go, in the sense that when it was first founded, that was its founding vision. Now it's been acquired, and the organization that acquired us was also recently acquired, so we've had to shift some of that philosophy a bit. But in general, that's always been a core component to the team that I'm on, is the sense that if the work we're doing has to require us to be face to face to be able to communicate effectively, we're doing something wrong. So that's always been part of our communication style and our approach. So I firmly believe in the idea of document everything, and document it in such a way that your teammates have to interact with it and give you feedback about it. Let me give you an example for this. I'm the release manager for my team. And it could be very easy for me to just say, well, I know how to do the releases. It's no big deal. And just make a very simple, well, if you ever have to, do a release, just run these steps and that'll be fine. And I realized, unfortunately, that that's pre-assuming that a lot of people already understand what I understand. And we've had a couple of times where I came back and they realized, oh, they couldn't actually cut a release when I was gone because they didn't know what was needed or how to do it. And when I thought that I had communicated well, not well enough. So I absolutely believe in over communicating and writing out what you need to do. This might be a small tangent, but I want to use this as an encouragement to people. Some people will think that if their knowledge is a little arcane, that there's job security in that. I want to completely stop you from thinking that way. If you don't have stuff written down and you don't have clear, objective, meaningful directions on what you're doing, it's not that that gives you job security. It's that people stop thinking about what you do. And it's easier then for them to say, well, what's this person doing? I don't see anything related to them. I don't know what they're up to. Is it really that important? And then, of course, when they leave later, oh, yes, I guess it was. So I'm of the mind that you should absolutely communicate what you're doing, write stuff down, even over analyze it if necessary, but filter it through other people and say, can you follow this? In fact, heck, I want you to do this release. I'm just going to sit back. And if you got questions, ask me. And I find that's valuable because then they say, here are a few steps I'm a little fuzzy on. Why do you do things this way? Or I would not do this like this. Why? What is the logic behind it? And sometimes I might explain something. They go, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And oftentimes they'll bring up something to me and go, hey, I forgot all about that. Or this is something that I haven't been doing. And you're right, that should be included in this. And then I rework the steps to include that. So I think it's really important to communicate with everybody across your team. Another thing that I would say as far as streamlining collaboration, because we're distributed, a lot of what we do with screen sessions, we do with meets, and we get together a lot. And I am absolutely a fan of pair testing. I'm a fan of driver navigator testing, where you sit down with a developer and see what they're actually working on and ask them questions in real time. And many times that has helped both bring testing together very quickly. It also opens up for where a developer would say, oh, you know what? We could probably work something here to make that easier for you to interact with, where if I didn't do that, we wouldn't have that conversation. So
Thanks, Michael. Frank, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so before I go into testing, I wanted to share a practice that we have at Kobiton that might be useful for other teams. Every Thursday night, night in the US. We have teams distributed or people distributed throughout the world. And instead of getting on a video conference to share updates, it starts at 10 o'clock p.m. in the US Eastern time. And we all get onto a Slack channel and we share updates and ask questions. And it lasts about an hour. But in that hour, everyone is brought up to speed on what's going on in the company. Doing that over a chat eliminates some of the communication issues because people speak 3 different languages, and it's sometimes difficult to understand when they're spoken. But it's a lot easier to read it. We've done that every week for the past 8 months, and it's provided a very effective way to keep everyone up to date on the status of the company and where we're heading. To dive down specifically into testing, testing is hard on its own, but communication around testing is even harder. And I'm going to focus on a specific area of communication, and that area is related to customer support, to testing, to development. And while technology exists today in products like Kobiton to capture full video of test executions, there's still many companies that do not, they type in the steps to reproduce. And in my opinion, and I think a lot of people believe this, that if you can actually see what was occurring on the device, we're talking about mobile, you're on the device when the defect occurred, it's a lot easier for the developer to understand what the root cause of the problem is and to troubleshoot it. And I find that steps to reproduce, the video all around that, is one of the most time-consuming, from a communication standpoint, time-consuming efforts within the organization. It addresses the physical distribution around the world, and it also it may not be just video. We provide a forensic level of analysis in the Kobiton session, including memory at 5-second intervals, CPU, network activity, screenshots, video. So exactly the log file of what was going on in the app. So you have forensic level information when there is a problem of what was happening. And I think that giving that a large amount of information right there and then is tremendously helpful in reducing the communication gaps that happen within an organization.
Let's talk a bit about extending quality throughout the entire company. And Frank, we'll go ahead and start with you.
So this is the one I was most excited about. And I'll start with a famous quote: "What is measured is managed." And, we have around the Kobiton office real-time board showing the metrics of our organization. And for mobile, testing on mobile, there is one great measurement that is the North Star of quality for a mobile application, and that's the App Store reviews. On average, only 16% of employees are aware of their company's mobile app review score. And that metric should be front and center of every board deck, of every monitor displaying in the office, of every employee portal, of every newsletter that goes out. That is the North Star indicator, and everything trickles off from that. The goal should be to find what that target is and work towards that target, that KPI. And there are a lot of KPIs that can fall out of that that are more leading indicators, because that, the KPI of the App Store review is a lagging indicator. It's there. But what can you then define as far as leading indicators to help make that a higher score? So that's, in summary, what I would do to galvanize the organization towards a common goal.
Paul, let's hear from you.
So I think the first point we've kind of clubbed to death on the previous couple of slides. So yes, I think we all nod our head and say everyone should contribute to quality in some way. Your testers and your QA people are not going to add quality. They're just going to be able to point out risks around delivery and around meeting goals. So going with KPIs, I like the idea of, first of all, I hate KPIs. Because that what it is measured is also gamed. So we have to be careful with how we put KPIs in place. But from the notion of understanding, are we there yet, and are we going in the right direction, and how much further do we have to go? I think App Store reviews certainly something that makes a lot of sense. A long time ago, I saw a keynote from Matt Johnson when he was at UTest. Before it was applause, talking about that was one of the key indicators of how you were doing as a business, and to a large extent of quality. It didn't matter how many bugs you had. It didn't matter what your development processes you were. If you didn't have 4 or 5 stars in the App Store, you probably weren't getting downloaded. So that was absolutely something to strive for, is to please your users, because ostensibly, if you're getting good reviews, your users are pleased, or at least the noisy ones are pleased. But a little more strategically, maybe a little less strategically, a little more tactically, what I think we need to look at is, are we delivering value? So the way we figure out, are we delivering value, is somebody way high up in the company has decided we need to do X. So all of our performance indicators are we closer to X than we were yesterday? That's the only one that really matters, because ultimately the only one that really matters is, are we making revenue? And therefore, are we being ostensibly profitable? And if not, why not? And what do we need to do about it? Because if we set the wrong business goal and we're not profitable, well, that's a different situation than we aren't meeting the goals. So day to day, we also have to remember, in addition to us being developers, testers, business people, whatever it is, we're also employees of a company, and we like to eat. We like to get paid. We like to be able to do things with our salaries. If the company is not profitable or sufficiently profitable, we are no longer going to get paid, and eventually the company is going to go away, and we'll have to go find something else to do. So really, the most key performance indicator is, are we profitable? And I understand that's a pretty sort of mercenary, cynical kind of view, but it has to sort of be in the background on all the decisions that we make.
Michael, let's hear your insights.
Well, I mean, in a sense, Paul just sort of stole my thunder, because that's very much what I was about to say, is that the key performance indicator really is the business making the right product for the right people, so that they can pay you to keep making the right product for the right people. I'll take this in a little bit of a different avenue. Sometimes we get a little bit focused, and I'll use my accessibility example again to help with this. In many cases, we can find ourselves in a negative focus situation. As I've mentioned many times, when it comes to accessibility, two reasons why accessible products tend to come to being, and I find this frustrating, but it's a reality, is that either A, somebody who's waving a lot of money in front of you is saying, we want your product, but it has to meet this criteria. So therefore, you then have to go on this very active, focused chase to be able to change your product, in many cases, to be able to make sure that it meets what this company needs to be able to buy your product. And if the money's good enough, then it makes sense to do that. But it can literally upend your organization, and it can become a very, very challenging prospect to manage all of that. So again, it's one of those things that if you're thinking about it up front and ahead of time, and you're already there, you don't find yourself in that situation. The more the more sinister aspect, though, and the one that really does happen fairly frequently, is that an organization gets sued because they aren't compliant with, say, the disabilities acts of given countries, and now they have to make their product accessible to a compliance standard, where before it may not have really mattered. Now that they've had to change everything that they're doing. So the whole point is that KPIs can be good, but if you're not focusing on the right things at first, sometimes those right things have a tendency of making themselves known front and center, and then all the other things that you were planning for or that you were trying to measure to see if you were doing a good job at something, they have to fall by the wayside because something much more important has taken precedence. So to that end, again, I think it's to mirror what Paul and others have said. I do agree that what is measured gets managed. What is measured does get gamed, and that's true too. But trying to focus on what really does matter, I would say honestly, really do whatever it takes to make sure that you are on the side of building the right thing for the right people, because they're ultimately who pay you. And by making products that are, again, I'll beat on this because it's my personal favorite. If you make products that are accessible to the most possible people, you're making good business sense for everybody. And I think that's a very important thing to consider. So best KPI for me to measure is to say, can the most possible people use our product effectively?
Let's talk about effective use of tools. And Michael, we'll go ahead and kick it off with you.
Okay, sure. So one of the things that I find personally is that a lot of focus is placed on, when we talk about automated testing and automated tools, a lot of the time what we're looking at is automated testing, especially from a interaction with a product. And so recently, of course, when you think of things like Selenium or Appium, for example, you are interacting with the product in a linear fashion, the way that a user would. Now, are those tests important? In many cases, they are. Sometimes they're the only tests that will verify that you're doing something the right way. But they're also very expensive, and they're tests that take a lot of processes. They're tests that take a lot of maintenance, and in some cases, they may actually not tell you all that much. So I firmly believe that yes, automation can be a good benefit, but I prefer using automation in places where they will maximize your gains. And so I'm much more of a fan of automation, say, for setting up your environments, for populating your environments, for getting data from multiple sources into your environments so that you have something to work with and something that you can use to be able to make the best determination possible. And I think that's where the biggest wins are. People will have different opinions of that, of course, but I think that it definitely helps a lot to be able to say, what can I do to set up my environments to be at a point to where I can do something meaningful with them? And more to the point also, even if I'm doing these tests and I'm running these tests linearly, do I have a method within those tests to stop them in real time? Because some of the neatest things you can set up, you've done these really elaborate tests and you've changed these states and you've done all these modifications. Instead of just running the test and saying, okay, I see what I expect to see, that test passed, and let's tear everything down and go to the next test, it would be nice to be able to say, okay, at this point, stop. Treat it like a taxi cab and say, I'm in a neighborhood I haven't explored all that much, but a lot's happened under the scenes now that it would take me hours to set up otherwise. Now let's go take a look. And I think those are valuable, that can enhance our testing in ways that just running tests over and over and over again may not give us that opportunity to do. As far as streamlining with CI/CD, I absolutely think it's essential. I think it's very valuable, and it saves a lot of time to be able to do that. It's especially important to be able to say that if you're merging something and you're doing a merge request, you want to make sure that you haven't broken anything and that at least the tests you have can cover what you think are the most likely scenarios. But very often, if you're not also actively keeping up with that development and making new tests because of that change that just went in, it's not, CI and CD isn't really going to help you because it's not going to necessarily confirm anything more for you than you already know. So it's a positive. It's definitely useful. I wholeheartedly approve of it, and I spend a fair amount of time with CI/CD. Not a magic bullet. You have to manage it. You have to put it together right, and it takes some tinkering from time to time.
So now who's stealing whose thunder? So yeah, Michael hit on one of the key points, one of the sort of the key aspects of automation for me, which is let's not think about automation as taking a test case and turning it into a test script with some tool or some language or something. For me, that is one implementation of automation, and it can be a very valuable one, especially when we're talking about something like a DevOps culture where we've got continuous delivery and we've got continuous testing going on. Having something that says the load that I just automatically shoved out to this environment is not egregiously broken because I ran a handful of shallow, quick automated checks that say, yeah, I have not detected any behavior changes from last time. Everything that you said to check for in this script appears to be the way it's supposed to be. Fantastic implementation, but other implementations like Michael was talking about around system setup, around getting you part of the way there, that is the bigger way that I like to look at automation, and it frees us up if we redefine this notion of automation to basically the judicious application of technology to help humans do their job. And in this case, the humans generally are the testers. So what do testers need help doing? Well, they need help testing. And sometimes it's, yes, I need you to run a little script that's going to go and try and buy with a credit card and make sure that you got an order number back. That proves a lot of things for us, right? It shows that in some cases we were able to buy with a credit card. But sometimes testers need to be able to create a bunch of data, or they need to be able to turn a crank 1,000 times and then look for some sort of differences between each of the results in those 1,000 times. Putting some tools together to help them be able to accomplish that part, in some cases, is as valuable or more valuable than doing the traditional test-based automation. And then when you bake those appropriately sized and appropriate duration and appropriately scoped tests or scripts into a continuous delivery tool, it can be highly effective in saying, okay, now humans, you don't have to turn as many cranks. You can go do some lateral thinking, some creative thinking, some critical thinking about what else do we need to do to this product to sort of ascertain whether or not we think it's sufficiently de-risked to deliver it out the door.
Yeah, great. And Paul and Michael, that was a very helpful, great setup. And I want to tee on one of the things that Michael used, one of the things Michael said, which was expensive. Automation is expensive. There's investment that needs to be made on the processes and the maintenance of automation, specifically when it comes to test automation using tools like Appium and Selenium. And ultimately, it's looking at it as a return on investment. If you try to automate a product that is not at the right level of maturity, then the effort in maintenance goes up substantially versus a product or a piece of functionality within an application that has is stable and is not changing that often. Because there you're looking at, you can make that investment on an automation script that would be run 30, 50, 1,000 times, and you'll be able to reap the rewards of that investment when it's mature. And I think I sort of look at it as 3 levels of maturity of an application and the different tools that you can use at those levels of maturity. Early on, it's manual. It doesn't make sense to invest in automation because there's going to be so much change in the application that you're going to spend more time maintaining it than just rerunning your manual tests. The second level, that is sort of a quick and dirty automation is the tools out there for record and playback. And if you just wanted to run against 50 devices and you record against one device, and you can then rerun that same test against 49 others. And then once a product gets mature, you start in making the investment in tools like Appium. And one of the things that we're building at Kobiton is the ability to execute a manual test from a single device and generate an Appium script from that manual execution. So it gives the tester a foundation of a manual, an automation script. It's not meant to be the maintenance part, but it gives them something to bootstrap automation. And it's using an open source technology. It makes the investment, upfront investment, a lot lower. And then, integrating to CI/CD, this is more of just a plug. We at Kobiton, we've invested in integrations. These are all in our GitHub repo, to Jenkins, Bamboo, Zevia Labs, Circle CI, and we believe that's critical to, once you have the automation in place, to creating a repeatable and fast continuous testing process within your organization. The one thing, Drew, that I wanted to tag on to that I really liked was reviewing the running test. I really love that idea, and we're building something around that at Kobiton, but not just reviewing the running test, but also being able to have the manual test, the tester, and the automation test work together to complete a certain task. So if an automation test is having an issue at a certain point, allowing the human to come in and remediate that issue.
What are some hacks for increasing bandwidth during high pressure release cycles?
Yeah, I can take the first pass at that. I think it's important to have a set of testers that can augment your testing organization for those crunch times. So that if you need additional resources, people who know your application, and you can pull in as augmented testers to just run manual tests and help with the limitations on the resources within the organization.
So for me, it kind of depends on how we're defining crunch time. Are we defining crunch time that the developers are done and everything came in the last couple of days of the sprint or of the release, and now the testers are working crazy hours and the developers don't have a whole lot to do? In that case, maybe the developers can help test, or other people on the team can help test. Or, hey, you know what takes me a long time for this particular aspect of this testing is that data generation I was talking about, or doing maybe a context sensitive diff. Programmers are great at writing programs. Perhaps they could cobble together a little tool to help the testers be more effective at their job. If what we're talking about is a whole team is under pressure and it's like fix, test, fix, test, fix, test, I don't know that there's much of a hack on that. That's either unfortunate planning or some really bad luck along the way.
So my thoughts for this are, I would say if you haven't tried mobbing, I would recommend giving it a shot. The idea behind mobbing is you get everybody together for a little bit, you time box it, and you say, what are our most, literally, what are our riskiest areas? What are the things that we know that if we blow it here, we are in big trouble? And everybody basically swarms on it and hits it. And it seems like you might think, oh, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You're just getting people who don't necessarily know what they're doing. But what happens is you get a lot of knowledge transfer, and also you get to see a lot of different perspectives as to what actually scares somebody about a release. And if you start dealing with those and you start mitigating them, you start to find that even crunch modes, or that those dreaded death marches, actually start to alleviate, because when you deal with the stress, when you deal with the riskiest areas first, and you hit those and get them resolved, you start to realize that a lot of the other areas have already taken care of themselves, and they've already come up in conversation, and they're either not that high of a priority, or, oh, we've already addressed that. Hey, neat. And so there's an additive effect to that. So
that's a great point, Michael. And it made me think of something else. I think I was thinking a little too narrowly of hack, as in, hey, we're in crunch time. What's something clever we can do to help us manage crunch time? I think what you kind of tickled in the back of my brain there is, okay, now we realize we have too much to do in the amount of time that we have left. How do we maximize the value of that time? And I don't remember if you said it or you made me think of it, but risk. Okay, what are the most risky things? What are the highest value things? We'll focus on making sure those work. And if we run out of time, then it's a message we deliver up to the decision makers to say, here are the things we tested and delivered or plan to deliver, and here's what we found about it. Here are the things that we did not. Are you still okay doing the release?
Awesome,
Yeah,
guys. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
I was gonna say, yeah, that's basically it. I find myself in these situations a lot of times saying, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. Even if we had all the time in the world, here's what we can't do. Are you okay with that? And oftentimes asking that, are you okay with that question really clarifies a lot of things, and it helps get the focus on where you need to be, because too often it just comes down to we've run out of time and we have to get this out, and there's just too much to do, and they're still thinking, but we're going to do it all anyway, right? And sometimes you have to brace them and say, no, we can't do everything, but we can focus on what's most important.
Michael and Paul, in your experience, sorry to jump in here, Drew, but in your experience, how often is the decision criteria for go and no go defined up front versus a last minute decision?
I would say it's not very frequent. I mean, we'd like to believe it's designed up front. We have, we have like a high level. This is what we think is important. There are no sub ones. There are no sub twos. The stuff that we say, we have to be in this position to be able to make a release happen. And sure, we want to be able to aim for that. And most of the time we can, and we do. But there are sometimes situations where something has come up and it's potentially an issue, but it's going to take time to fix it. That's going to threaten a release. And you have to weigh that out and say, look, do we go or don't we? And as testers, sometimes we might think of ourselves as still being that final tackle on the field, which I guess technically is still true. But really, we're not the ones who say that a product is going out the door or not. We can say, hey, I found this. These are some situations we have. And sometimes I still use that the phrase in meetings. If this was going to show up on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow about our company, what would your reaction be? And very often that is, okay, let's reconsider this. Let's give this another time. Or, yeah, that's a bad enough situation. Yeah, we can afford 2 more weeks.
Right.
And suddenly you have no time. Oh, but yes, you do.
Right.
So a lot of it really does come down to asking those questions and not being afraid to say, I don't want to step on toes, but I'm also not going to be the one to say, I am the final arbiter of what's going to happen here.
Right.
What I can do is say, as your Cub reporter, here's the story I have. Now you decide whether or not it's going on page 9 as an addendum, or it's going on the front page.
Yeah, makes sense.
Awesome. Well, unless anyone has anything else to add, for the sake of time, I know we've got a couple of hard stops on our end. We will go ahead and wrap. Again, thank you to our audience for attending today, and thank you very much to our panelists for speaking. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and enjoy the holidays. Thanks, everyone.
All right, same to you. Thanks a lot.
Very much. Thank you.